Hi there, let's get started on fun painting techniques on a mountain landscape. I decided to start this painting on a Quinacridone Magenta ground, which was mixed with some GAC 500, which is an acrylic medium. Once this ground color was dry, I took Dioxazine Purple and added a lot of GAC 500 medium to make the drawing easier and easier to wipe off as well with a moist cloth. If you're following along on this video and you want to paint this, don't bother painting these trees in right now. I decided later to paint the background mountains first and put the trees on top, which I don't always do, but this time I decided to. Really look at the angles that you see on the edge of this mountain where it meets the sky. And if you look at the sky as well as the mountain when you're painting, it makes it a lot easier to see what you need to draw. Before painting this background mountain, it makes it a lot easier if on your palette you pre-mix a tint of Phthalo Blue and a tint of Dioxazine Purple. Another thing to do if you're working on a wrapped canvas like this one is you can spray water on the back of your canvas, and this will give you more open time to paint. Open time simply means the amount of time you have before that paint dries. Silicone tipped color shapers are very handy for removing wet paint. Move your painting tool in different directions to make those strokes look a little bit more interesting. While the paint is wet, continue to shift the colors between the violet and the blue colors. And once you're happy with those, while the paint is still wet, take a tint of Quinacridone Magenta, which is that color added with white, and gently make some strokes on top of the blue and violet colors. It's a little easier to get transition colors when you mix wet onto wet. This will still work if your background paint has already dried. This is a tint of Dioxazine Violet. There's just a tiny bit of color in that white. To vary the warm and the cool, add a tint of Cadmium Yellow. A good device for a painting is to have something lead into the painting from the bottom. These decaying tree trunks are perfect for this. To create these trees, I did a layer of Cobalt Green, and this green is mixed with some of the GAC 500 to make it more goopy. If you decide where the tree trunks are going to go, you can use your palette knife or brush to make some vertical strokes, and then grow your branches from these tree trunk strokes. Make sure to vary the size of your trees. If they're too uniform, it will look awkward. Be aware when you're placing your tree trunks to put them in places that are going to look really good for your painting. The tallest tree that's on here so far is right on the 1/3 mark. Alternatively, you could also put them on the golden mean mark. Join the bases of all these trees into a mass at the bottom. Keep going. Add the big tree on the left-hand side using slightly bigger brush strokes or marks with your palette knife using the same cobalt green. Allow little bits of that magenta to show through. This large foreground tree on the left helps to frame those mountains in the background. If you want to show more of your underpainting while that green paint is wet, you can scratch some of the paint off with your color shaper. Add vertical marks on that distant hillside to indicate some more trees. Make these marks triangular. Using cobalt green plus some titanium white, add the little bit of lake showing on the right lower side. We also need to add some trees on the bottom left. Use that cobalt green. And when you're done the little darker parts, take some of the cobalt green that you've tinted with white and put some of that green on the edges of these little trees. Once all the green trees are done, you can take some titanium white and add a little bit of cadmium yellow medium into it to warm it up, and then paint the sky area. On my palette, besides the tint of yellow, I tinted Pyrrole Red Light in about the same shade as the yellow. I used a moist paper towel to smudge some of those colors together. On my palette I also have tints of Phthalo Blue, slightly brighter yellow, and also of some of the magenta. And so as I start to paint the sky across the top, I was able to use those colors to do a gradation from the light yellow to sort of that Pyrrole Red Light color to the magenta color, and then adding that brighter yellow on top. Then I also took some more of the Phthalo Blue, mixed it together, and went on top of some of those colors just to do a variation of color and also of temperature of warms and cools. These two methods are two of my most favorite fun painting techniques, that of doing a gradation across the sky and also doing that variation of color. Let's leave that sky for now and work a little bit on the foreground. With some Pyrrole Orange, what I'm doing is making it quite thin and placing it in various places on the magenta, making sure to leave some of the magenta showing. Scratch into that orange paint while it's still wet with your color shaper. This makes it look like there's some grassy marks. Glance around at your painting and see if there's any areas where you need to add some more light marks. I decided to add a tint of the magenta color on top of those fallen trees and the background hills and a couple of spots in the sky. Glazing is a really fun painting technique. It works really well to use an underpainting that's a little bit lighter, knowing that you're going to darken it with a glaze later on. This is a magenta glaze first laid on the top of that green color that we placed earlier, and then I used some Dioxazine Purple to darken down the lower parts of the trees where the shadows would be darker. And this change of color throughout the trees makes it a little more interesting too. While that paint is wet, I take a color shaper and lift some of the paint off the trees. I want to make sure to leave some of that green color. Use the same technique for the little trees on the left hand side and add a little bit more of the light green if you need to. I took that Cobalt Green and I also added some to the trees in the background just to bring back some of that green color. I also added a little bit of a Dioxazine Purple shadow underneath the fallen trees in the foreground. Once the trees are mostly done, I took some of the GAC 500 and added it to Dioxazine Purple to add some shadows into the foreground. It looks a little bit milky white as I add it, but that is the medium. Once that dries, that is going to be a much darker color. And as I did with the orange bits, I took a color shaper and scraped into that wet paint to give the feeling of grasses. For the bit of lake on the right hand side, use a glaze of Phthalo Green. Next we're adding some yellow oxide onto the meadow in the front. It's interesting how the yellow oxide takes on a little bit of a greenish look against the magenta and the purple. It also looks a lot brighter than it does when it comes out of the tube. Lift and push this yellow oxide paint around with that color shaper. Now I took a glaze of nickel azo yellow, which is a very transparent yellow, and added it over top of the trees just to brighten them up a little bit. Remember that when you're going to glaze something, the paint underneath needs to be very dry. Also make sure to have a moist paper towel or rag in your hand to wipe off excess glazes when you need to. I decided to take some of the Phthalo Green and glaze over that background mountain to create some more intriguing layers of color. I find that Phthalo Green over violets is a very lovely color in the end. If at this stage you think that you need to darken some areas, you can use your Dioxazine Purple, or you can take Carbon Black or a Mars Black and glaze over the shadows. Notice how much brighter that yellow oxide looks against the darks. Because acrylic paints dry darker, you might find at the end stage of a painting that you need to go back in and relighten some areas. Here I've taken a tint of Phthalo Blue and added some snowy areas to the background mountains. I'm also taking the same tint of blue and I'm going to add it to those little trees in the foreground. I want to brighten up the highlight areas of those little trees. Once the tint of Phthalo Blue is dried on those trees, I will do a glaze of nickel azo yellow to turn them back into green. Use that same tint of Phthalo Blue and add it into the foreground as little sticks. This little bit of blue is a nice relief to all the worms. I think that little hill on the right hand side is a little too bright looking, so let's add some shadows using a tint of Dioxazine Purple. Let's play around in the sky a little more to make the colors more interesting. You can use any of the colors you've used within your painting, tint them the same value, and then place these colors into the sky. The trick and the fun technique for this is to make sure that you allow some of the underneath colors to continue to show through. The nickel azo yellow on the blue isn't quite the color that I want, so I think I'm going to need to redo that. Instead, I'm going to use a tint of Dioxazine Purple with a glaze of Phthalo Green. I'm going to do the same in some areas for those vertical trees in the background, just to bring that color up into there and to lighten them as well. So let's see how that looks. Before I glaze the yellow onto the background trees, I'm taking a little bit of cadmium yellow and placing some little dots of bright color into the foreground meadow. When making little dots like these, try to be random and to change them up. Don't do them all exactly the same distance apart and the same size. Okay, time for the Phthalo Green on top of these trees in the background. And then once that's done, I will let it dry and put another layer of nickel azo yellow. And I think that'll create a really nice bright green for those trees, as if so you can really imagine the light hitting the side of those. I just worked on a little bit on the edges of those tree branches to make them look a little bit more natural. Okay, I think this little mountain landscape is done. When you weren't looking, I put a little bit of a Phthalo Blue glaze into the sky just to give it a little bit more darkness. I hope you give this little painting a try. It's a lot of fun to do. Thanks so much for watching. Subscribe for notice of new videos. Take care.